Aha!
and then you'll press the button.
Yeah.
And again. Pressing the button in the middle.
Yeah.
Go, which means press
Okay, I think we're going to, if people are happy, we're going to try and make a start. Good morning. My name's Steve McCabe. I'm the Member of Parliament for Selly Oak, which has the misfortune to just be outside the postal address for the university. But I get the benefit of having many of the students and staff living in my constituency. So we're really pleased to be here in Birmingham this morning. Obviously, one of the things about the Select Committee is we like to get out on the road and not look just like a London and Westminster-based outfit. And we're delighted to be here. I'm told that I should tell people that if they're going to speak, you have to press the microphone to make sure that it's picked up properly. I want to thank Professor Becca and Ed Thomas for helping put this together this morning. We're very grateful. And I'll very briefly introduce the committee. We've got James Cartledge, Craig McKinley, Karen Buck, Mary Black, and our chairman, Frank Field, who has very generously asked me to chair this morning's session since we're in Birmingham. That may prove to be his first mistake, but, but there you go. And I'm going to ask the panel, if I can, to each in turn to introduce themselves, partly just to make sure that we have got everyone on the microphone. So if you could just say who you are, what you're, and where you're from, that would be really helpful. And should we start with Louise?
Yes, hello. My name is Louise Haagh. I'm a reader in politics at the University of York, and I'm also the elected co-chair of the Basic Income Earth Network, which is an international society that fosters informed discussion about basic income throughout the world.
Hello, my name is Annie Miller. I'm a retired academic economist. I'm also chair of the Citizens Income Trust, which I helped to found 32 years ago. And I stay in Edinburgh, and so we've recently set up a Citizens Basic Income Network Scotland to deal with the Scottish side of things.
Good morning, I'm Becca Kirkpatrick. I live here in Birmingham, and today I'm here in the capacity as the chair of the West Midlands community branch of UNISON, and I'm also part-time a carer for a disabled relative.
My name is Ben Southwood. I'm head of research at the Adam Smith Institute. Yeah, that's more or less explains.
My name is Peter Alcock. I'm an Emeritus Professor here at the University of Birmingham, where I was still am in a sense, a Professor of Social Policy, and Social Security Policy was one of my areas of research. I'm also, Steve, one of your constituents.
I'm Declan Gaffney. I'm an independent policy consultant specialising in income distribution and social security.
I'm Andrew Harrop. I'm General Secretary of the Fabian Society, and I wrote a report last summer on the future of social security.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. Well, the purpose, as people may be aware of this session, is the committee wants to have a one-off evidence session on the question of a basic income or a citizen's income. Seems to be an idea that's not entirely new, but there seems to be a bit of newfound interest in it of late. And obviously, at a time when we are thinking about welfare and changes that may have to happen to the welfare structure in the coming years, it seems useful to look at this. And also, actually, I was listening just the other day to a program about what's going to happen with the growth of robot technology and the impact that will have in the employment situation, and whether or not we're going to have the same work capacity for individuals. So again, it may be this makes this a more poignant issue. I think what would be helpful to the committee to start is if I ask each of you in turn to very briefly tell us whether you're in favour or against the idea, and if you could very briefly describe how you think it might work, and then different members of the committee will have particular aspects that they will want to raise with people. So I think, should we just start again with Louise?
Okay. Well, I'm certainly in favour of the principle and of the policy of introducing a universal basic income. I think we all know that the idea looks very different in practice in different contexts. I also think that the idea of universal basic income is not a magic bullet. It sits together with a range of other progressive reforms that I think are timely and important today to the welfare state and to labour market institutions. And so in this sense, I very much am in favour of a reform that leads the welfare state towards a more unconditional, universal form of basic security at the base, but that I see that as a foundation for other very important progressive changes, including in terms of the investment in skills and a more green economy. And so I think we shouldn't look at basic income just in isolation. However, what I do think is very interesting and difficult to ignore is when you have an idea that seems to be popping up in all different parts of the world, across the ideological spectrum, between different groups of society, and very interesting in the last year or so, across Europe, public officials themselves administering income assistance systems are beginning to look to this idea and experimenting with it at the local level. Governments are doing it, but very interestingly, local public administrations are doing it because of the difficulties and many feel the punitive measures that exist now in implementing conditional income assistance schemes. So the way I see it is that this is an idea that is happening on the ground, looking for an argument rather than an argument looking for a practice. And therefore, it really is very important, I think, to open the discussion about what kind of transitions we can see towards implementing a more humane form of basic security at the bottom of the welfare state, which is urgently needed. So that is where I stand, and I can give some evidence and ideas about what people are doing around the world to foster more knowledge about the idea and also to take steps to implement it. Thank you.
Annie.
Yes. I'd like to endorse everything Louise has said, and that saves me having to repeat it. So in addition, I'd like to say that it's defined by being based on the individual, it's universal, unconditional, not means-tested, non-selective except by age, and would be delivered regularly and automatically to recipients. Now, that definition doesn't actually tell you how to design a scheme. The scheme would only cover basic needs. It's never going to allow people to have lives of luxury. So there's still, it provides for necessities, but luxuries would still have to be earned. There would have to be a separate housing benefit system because we've such a variation of housing costs and rents and prices over the country. And there would also have to be a separate disability benefit system, parallel, separate, but in addition to the basic income. Now, any particular scheme, there's no one optimum scheme. Each scheme is dependent on the objectives, the priorities, the assumptions and the constraints of the people who are devising the scheme. And therefore you can get up with a very wide range of possible schemes. So depending on what your objectives are, you would choose one rather than another. And if you gave me your objectives, I could probably design a scheme for you. I enjoy doing that sort of thing. But these starting points should be made clear at the outset. Otherwise, you can get very confused about what's going on and why. I can talk later about how to start off with small schemes and then developing them for implementation. But I don't think that's what you're looking for now. I think that's all that's worth saying at the moment, except I endorse everything Louise said, that it needs to be in a wider context.
Thank you. Becca.
Thank you. Personally, I'm in favour, my family's in favour, my branch is also in favour of basic income, and the UNISON West Midlands region as a whole, which is represents about 118,000 workers, is in favour of testing out the policy here in the region, and we're going to be asking the candidates for the new elected mayor, the Metro Mayor, to look into that. And we've found it helpful this past year where we've been discussing the idea in various circles to think about it on 3 levels. One being as a kind of philosophical principle that all humans have the right to exist and to have their basic essential needs covered and secured and guaranteed. So that's one way of debating the concept. Then there's the idea of a policy in isolation of an unconditional cash transfer, which could be of varying sizes, and our colleagues to the right have touched on some of those structural approaches there. But then also as a part of a wider programme, which has its own objectives, as Annie referred to. So, for example, it could be as part of a anti-poverty strategy that includes other complementary policies alongside it. In terms of what it might look like, how it might work, what I find hard to escape is the fact that this is a wealthy and abundant society, and so it seems to me, therefore, pretty much a question of political will and the kind of balance of what the public of this country would like to see and believe they're entitled to, based on the conditions of the country. So later on today I can talk from a personal family perspective of why it's important to me and what it would mean to the people that I know and love, and also my role as branch chair, the workers that we organise, what it would mean for their lives as well. And we've done quite a lot of listening over the past year, so today I've actually brought along some of our own qualitative evidence of what people across the region think of the idea. It might surprise you, but I'll be pleased to discuss that a bit later on.
Thank you. Ben.
So obviously I come from a slightly different perspective from many of the panellists, so it might be surprising that I'm also strongly in favour of the basic income. But the history of the policy is possibly surprising. Hayek in A Road to Serfdom put it in as his welfare policy. Milton Friedman was one of the first supporters in the USA of it under the name the negative income tax, which is functionally the same, except for the pay-in, pay-out systems are slightly different. But in terms of net payment to people, it's exactly the same, so long as Annie said, you structure it in a particular way based on your goals. The first experiments on the basic income were done by Richard Nixon, Donald Rumsfeld, and Dick Cheney across 5 US cities. So it has a long pedigree of being the kind of idea that not just a particular set of perspectives could be interested in, and has some strange allies. Accordingly, I also think of it, I favour it for different reasons and possibly with different provisions. We tend to think that the idea of a basic income is to simplify the welfare system, not change the overall progressivity, although maybe you would have extra money through lower administration. That's yet to be seen. Also, to reduce the cost of going out to work and changing your lifestyle when you are receiving benefits. At the moment, as we know, we've been trying to reform that without that much success recently, but there's a goal of reducing the implicit tax rates. Also, people who have irregular incomes, it means that you don't see boosts and falls in your incomes from work, and meaning that you have a disincentive to going out to work because you're worried about losing your benefits. So all these sorts of precarious situations, you could pay out the same amount of money but solve them. But as I say, we see this as replacing most of the benefit system rather than being in addition to it. And if it were in addition to it, I'd say that probably it's going to come to the point where we're probably spending too much and we'd have to raise taxes too much to make this system worth doing. But as a way of rationalising our existing system, I think it's an extremely good idea. Just enhances the freedom of people who are receiving money from the states. So,
Thank you. Peter.
Hi. I first came across the basic income idea back in the 1970s when I was first doing research on social security reform, at a time when I was also quite active as a volunteer in welfare rights work in Sheffield, where I lived at the time. Which and the latter in particular made me think really it would be better if we could find a better way to do this, because there were all sorts of people were experiencing all sorts of problems with the social security scheme, and the basic income looked like, well, to be honest, it looked like a magic bullet, although it's interesting, as Ben's just pointed out, different people were trying to use the bullet in different kinds of guns. So I spent a bit of time looking at the basic income and reading stuff around it, and eventually I published an article in the early 1980s called Misplaced Optimism, called Unconditional Benefits, Misplaced Optimism in Income Maintenance. And you can guess from the title that the conclusion that I came to was that it wasn't a magic bullet, and that actually it was more likely to be a distraction from the kind of problems that I was coming across in my research and finding in my welfare rights practice. It does sound like a good idea. Why don't we just give everybody enough to live on and then let them decide how to live their lives? It's such an appealing idea that it's too good to be true, and I'm afraid that my view is that it is too good to be true. I've been a critic of it ever since then, not because I don't think it's a good idea, because I don't think it's feasible in the kind of economic and political circumstances that we currently find ourselves in. And therefore, there's a danger that it acts as a distraction from other pressing issues around employment, inequality, and support for welfare services. I am slightly worried that it has had support from people like Charles Murray and Milton Friedman in the United States. Murray argued that we should pay everybody a basic income and then we can withdraw all welfare services because they can buy them themselves. You don't need to deliver services to people because they can buy them on the market. They can buy them on the market because they'll have an income. So I'm worried that it's a distraction from other more pressing issues.
Thank you. Declan.
I'm in danger of just repeating most of what Peter has just said. Last year I wrote an article for The Guardian about basic income, in which I actually said it was too good to be true, and that was the headline, in fact. And the conclusion that I reached was that basic income is best thought of as a thought experiment. And that was unpopular with some supporters of basic income. I actually meant it as a compliment, and that I think it is a useful thought experiment. It is a way in which one can hone one's intuitions about a whole range of issues to do with reciprocity, to do with property rights, to do with freedom. And it can be very helpful in tightening up one's perceptions and one's intuitions in that area. But as a practical proposition, what tends to happen is that basic income, or universal basic income, is sold under this brand of universality and flat rate payments. And then one finds that as you move from that abstract idea of a single flat rate income going to everybody to some kind of practical implementation, the elements on which it is sold, the lack of conditionality, the flat rate basis and so on, begin to fall away. And it starts to gradually become more and more like an adaptation of existing social security systems. We've already heard that current proposal of basic income would involve having a separate housing benefit. That means that you would have means testing, which is one of the main selling points about basic income. You get away from means testing, but it comes back in once we start trying to address housing costs. There would be a separate disability benefit. This is only right and proper, but that does imply some testing of disability status. So you're back to having the welfare state making judgments about people's ability to work. So as you move closer towards the real world, it begins to look like a tweak to existing social security arrangements rather than the kind of root and branch change which its advocates tend to sell it as, so that we get overselling of what are often relatively modest changes to the existing system, being presented as being revolutionary changes, or alternatively we get utterly utopian schemes which have got zero chance of practical implementation, being sold as solutions to problems which we don't even know whether they exist yet or not, such as the problem of robots taking all the jobs. So I'm extremely sceptical about the entire basic income programme, and I'm extremely aware that what is being sold under that brand is often very far away from what it seems to be.
Thank you. Andrew.
So in the report I published last summer, there's actually an appendix which has the for and against arguments, for and against the basic income, and you're very welcome to look at that afterwards. But that gives you an indication of where I'm coming from. I started sitting on the fence. What I don't think anyone else has yet mentioned is that really the debate about basic income should be seen through the prism of tax reform more than social security reform. And the reason I say that is that tax-free reliefs and allowances are a huge part of the basic income debate, because this is a suggestion that you would take away those tax-free allowances and give people cash instead. And actually in our system in this country now, tax-free allowances are, financially speaking, more important than social security. We already have effectively a basic income. It's just not a universal basic income. We give people who are earning enough to claim to make full use of personal allowance and the equivalent to national insurance, £60 a week, equivalent to a cash basic income, through the tax system. The question is, could we use that money better by distributing it more smoothly to everyone, and in particular to people on zero or low earnings and to children? And in an ideal world, I would like to see, rather than the personal allowance and the equivalent to national insurance system paid to those earning enough to benefit from it, a lower cash, flat cash payment going to people who are not in a position to benefit from those allowances, and particularly to children. My view, though, is opposed to some of those who have spoken before, because I don't think that should replace means-tested benefits. I think we should have a tiered system of social security that includes more scope for universal, non-conditional payments, but also has means-tested universal credit and contributory benefits for those who have earned entitlement.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, that's a very good introductory round. Who wants to go first? Karen.
One of the questions that I'm never quite clear about in terms of is whether advocates regard this as being an alternative to income in a future world where there is less employment or less stable employment, or as a form of work incentive or smoothing out what is in for some people, at least in the more casualised economy, a very uncertain income. Can it be both? And how seriously do we need to take? Because the UBI's kind of current phase of popularity, I think, is very much predicated on some views about the changing world of work. How seriously do we need to take those projections? Because if we do need to take them seriously, we may need to look at how we refine the tax and social security system to deal with it. And as a subsection to that question, is it realistic in a world where welfare states have become more conditional that we can win democratic support for a system that removes conditionality? I mean, Declan mentioned particularly the issue about the future world of work. I mean, what's your view of that?
My view is that I don't know and nobody else does. However, it's not as if we've never been here before. It's not as if we've never had people discussing a universal basic income in the prospect of massive job losses, because exactly the same thing happened during the 1970s and the 1980s. During a period of huge traumatic change in the labour market, not just in the UK, but throughout the developed world. And that was the period when I first became aware of proposals for a universal basic income, and they were promoted back then in almost exactly the same terms as they are often promoted today. That, the idea was that deindustrialisation was going to lead to a permanent loss of employment, that full employment was completely gone as a policy objective, and therefore you would have to find some way of supporting people and essentially of taking people out of the labour market or of allowing them to reduce their hours of work. So effectively it was a technique for reducing labour supply in the face of what was seen as being a permanent collapse in labour demand. And the idea kind of began to wane in popularity as employment to a large extent recovered after the recessions of the 1980s and the early 1990s. And as it moved back towards higher levels of employment, the idea of basic income began to retreat. So the idea that we're facing a permanent loss of employment due to economic developments which are undoubtedly taking place due to technological change and so on, this is not new, but the last time it happened, we didn't see the kind of permanent loss of employment that would justify which would build the case for a universal basic income. And so we don't know what's going to happen this time. My view I tend to go with the views of Alan Manning at the LSE on this, because he is one of our best labour market economists, and his view on this, his considered view, was that the impact of technology on employment is effectively zero in the medium term, the long term. So I'm sceptical about these prophecies that we're going to see this permanent loss of labour demand.
Can I ask one of the advocates? I mean, are you looking at basic income as preparation for a world without work, or to allow people to dream or have surfing lessons, which, to grossly caricature Anthony Painter, is kind of the kind of view of some of the more romantic advocates of UBI? Or is it about improving work incentives and giving people a basic security to do more insecure employment?
So we, as UNISON and my branch of UNISON, we see it as something that we need and can afford and should have as a society right now. Ahead of any changes that may come, we think it could help with some of the changes that may come our way, but we actually think it's something that would be important to have in the here and now. And your your second
But
question...
can I just ask you why? I mean, what's it for?
Because of the fact that people don't have their basic living conditions secured and guaranteed.
In work or out of work or both?
Either. We don't have anything in place that ensures that people don't fall into destitution, die as a result of poverty in one of the fifth or sixth richest
Is that
economies.
right?
Yes, of course it is.
Is that right because of conditionality or because the system doesn't exist?
Because the system doesn't exist. We're not set up, we don't have that objective as society to prioritise guaranteeing that for everyone. We haven't taken a decision that we need to ensure that rather than having a safety net, a very holy safety net that's supposed to shoot out when people need it and they're already falling, why not have a solid platform that's there continuously?
But if it doesn't cover for disability, sickness and housing, how does the UBI do that?
What it's saying is that every human has basic needs of sustaining themselves and providing, the basic means of communication and getting around and a roof over their head. Some people have additional needs, and we would recognise those, and that's been referred to already. I wanted to come to your other question about is it feasible and realistic, and I think you're talking about political feasibility in terms of public opinion, and that's a very good question. And we, as the UNISON branch, also wanted to find out the answer to that ourselves. We actually expected when we went out to listen to people's views on it that we would receive quite a lot of pushback based on sort of that common sense idea of what people believe in this country. So we thought, let's actually test it out and find out for ourselves. And just to be clear, that we were very much approaching it on, if you remember from my introduction, I said about the 3 ways of thinking about it. We were going out to have a conversation on the philosophical level. So what do people in this region believe about the idea that we should guarantee everyone's... I mean, there's different ways of guaranteeing people's security, but this was one. What do people think of it? We were expecting some robust debate and perhaps more people, because of that idea of getting something for nothing, or that you should work, very strong work ethic that exists in this country, and the dislike of freeloading. We expected to get a lot of that, and we were actually very surprised that so far we found overwhelmingly the opposite. What I've got here is a folder which I'll leave for the panel to keep and have a look at afterwards. So we were asking people on an individual basis, what would it mean for them? What would they choose to do with their life if they had something in place to ensure their security like this? Lots of examples were about either caring in the family, it was about actually their own education and development, and about giving back to the community. That was a very strong theme that you'll see in this folder of evidence here. And then we were also, at the same time, after having a conversation with people, asking them to indicate in a very simple ball poll, we had a yes and no box. At the end of the conversation, are they in favour or against the idea?
Sorry, did you give them a figure of how much it would be?
No, we discussed that it could be different figures, but we also had the conversation with people that it's about political will. So there's lots of different ways. We had that as part of our conversation. We explained it could be, less than subsistence. It could be subsistence level. A level to eradicate poverty, which is the preferred version that my UNISON branch is in favour of. Just... Yeah.
Can you pick up Peter's point about what would happen to the tax rates? Was that introduced into the conversation, what people would be paying in tax to ensure everybody have this basic allowance?
Sure, yeah. I mean, this was a quite an open conversation we had with people, that there's many different ways it could be funded. In a nutshell, we would be in favour of progressive and redistributive taxation. That could include new forms of tax that we don't currently have. We are not, we've heard some of the other panel members saying, if this is a magic bullet. We're actually not saying this is the only policy we should introduce. We're in favour of lots of other policies to go alongside this. And from my introductions talking about my third way of thinking about the idea is about a part of a programme. So we could have a programme of reducing inequality, a programme of creating security for people. So we would see it as just one thing we'd like to see introduced in this country. So we would be in favour of progressive redistributive taxation, including perhaps new funding streams that don't currently exist. And the level is going to very much depend on how it's funded. So we said with people we were meeting, all this is up for debate. It's the start of the debate. What do you think of the idea, the principle? And you'll see from this folder that we could count the negative conversation we had on both my hands. of all the listening tours we did, it was really, really surprising to us. We expected a lot more pushback. What we're going to do this year is very much carry on that listening. We want to do as much as we can in as many varied different areas as possible, the different demographics, different political voting, leaning ways, and really just test it out as rigorously as we can. But so far, from last year's listening work, which I'll leave with you today, we found it very popular as a concept with people. You'll also be aware, hopefully, that there's been a European-wide survey of many tens of thousands of people, which indicated that already, with a very low level of debate in this country, 62% of people in this country support a subsistence-level basic income.
Thank you. I think, James, did you want to...
Yeah, thank you. So I've got a few points, really. They all connect to because I think the amount is incredibly important, because the generosity is absolutely key to it. But just a few... On the only experience I've had politically of this, before we had in the general election campaign, ITV Anglia filmed a debate at my biggest secondary school. And because the Green Party had it, it was asked as a question. The Green candidate explained about it, and the children, all of them, no prompting, were very strongly against it, interestingly. And the first question that was asked to the Green candidate was, why should I study, interestingly? And so, well... And so an interesting point about incentives. The second thing, so my experience as an employer, which I have made this point several times, but I think it's incredibly important about the tax credit system at the moment. Do not underestimate the extent to which people are very aware of what they get and the impact it has. I had staff who declined pay rises because of tax credits, but particularly who would never work more than 16 hours or 24 hours. Now, I can see how that could be a good reason to have a universal benefit system, because you don't get these things, only if it is very generous. That, I think, is the issue, because if there's no housing benefit included in it and there's no incapacity benefit or disability benefit, it has got to pay more than tax credits are paying to those on low pay. Now, that becomes very generous. If it is that generous, it's incredibly expensive, and you are paying that amount to Wayne Rooney and all the other wealthy people. And if it's not generous, you are reducing what you pay to you must be, to me, reducing what you pay to the poorest. I don't see any, so I think the amount you pay is incredibly important. I also want to ask about the impact on immigration, because people talk about, the impact of robots, all the rest of it. I stayed in a hotel in Westminster last night. Every member of staff is from Eastern Europe. We have a session next week on this, because businesses across my constituency, across the country, have very large numbers of people from the EU and elsewhere doing jobs that, for one reason or another, we don't seem to have a labour market for in this country. And it seems to me we do have to ask ourselves, what would be the impact of a generous basic income in a situation where we're going to have less foreign workers to fill unskilled positions? I'd be interested in the opinion of that. But I think the most important question, how generous? Is it more generous than what is the low levels of tax, what tax credits that are paid to those in low incomes? I think that's the most important question, really.
Sorry. So I think there's a useful categorization difference which might clarify some of those answers, and also how I think about it. I think about it differently from many of the people to my right here. I see it as replacing the current system. Maybe we can have disability on the side, and we can argue about housing benefit, because I think I have a different perspective from these people about housing benefit. But I don't see any reason. So 2 points. One is that historically, it's been known as the basic income or the negative income tax. And the negative income tax is paid in a different way. Instead of paying a lump sum to everyone, you look at the point at which we start charging people tax. People who earn less than that get a negative tax, as in, if they earn £1 less than that, they get a 50p top-up. If they earn £2 less than that, they get a £1 top-up. And we can see this system seems like it's paying out much less money, right? Because you don't give it to any of the people who earn at or above the amount you set as that crossover point.
But this is not true, is it? Basic income is a totally different proposal from negative income
here's
tax.
why it's exactly the same in
under
practice
basic
in terms of
income,
net
we'd
payments.
all get a lump of money.
So that's
under
only
your
a
scheme,
cosmetic feature of the system.
I wouldn't get it.
The reason why they're the same is that so in a negative income tax system, set a point, pay people money underneath, take money out of people above. Basic income, you give the money at the bottom, and then you tax people right from that amount. In the negative income tax, you don't tax people from that amount until they hit the point where you start taxing them. In the basic income system, you tax them right from the bottom. So when you give £5,000 to Wayne Rooney under this system, say, you also add his taxes £5,000 automatically under the system. Every basic income proposal has that built in. You don't give any extra money to rich people. It's very easy to make the net payment to rich people the same.
Sorry, but what it says in here is it is a universal entitlement paid as a cash
but
benefit.
It involves, so as Andrew said, it would necessarily involve removing the.
Can I just ask those to your right or to your left, as it were? Is that are you? How do you perceive the physical payment, as it were? Is it in this sense, or is it like a benefit?
Samuel Britton, about 30 years ago, pointed out that a basic income, which is favoured by people who are concerned about poor, is a separate payment, and then the tax system would claw back. In the negative income tax system, it's a different administration, whereby the tax and benefit systems are integrated, and so you either receive a net payment after your taxes have been deducted, or you get a net benefit after your taxes have been deducted. So they're different administratively, but they could produce the same output. Could I just point out the problem with housing benefit is not a problem of the basic income, it's a problem of the housing policy. And if you get your housing policy right, then it needn't be a problem.
Yes.
It's getting quite complicated for
James,
such a simple proposal.
just before we move on to your second point and I bring Mary in, can I just ask, while we're on this question of housing benefit and disability benefits and things like that having to be separate, how different is what's been described once you factor those in? How different is that from universal credit? Because it sounds to me like we're describing something very similar, and I'm just wondering if I've got the wrong end of the stick here.
Very quick answer. Universal credit is usually household-based rather than individual-based, and all basic income proposals are typically individual-based. Secondly, universal credit has gone to extreme extents to try and make sure no one is worse off under the new system. Under a basic income proposal, you have to accept some people are going to be worse off, some people are going to be better off. Overall, it's going to be more progressive.
Universal credit is means tested.
Right, but
the whole point of this, I thought, was it's not means tested. I mean, unless I'm completely naive.
So,
Steve, can we not have it from basic income? Isn't it that we say the income you're going to pay is 8,000? All of us individually would get £8,000, maybe less for children or maybe more for children, and the rest of it, and then you set tax rates to finance this proposal. It is not like negative income tax or all of those other proposals. It is separate.
Sorry,
are we
Dean.
not right? Isn't that what James is asking you?
Yeah. Can you just, Dean, because you were the first to write, one of you two was the first to write on this. Peter. Peter. What is, if you were to summarise what you think the general proposal is?
They have been confused in the past, and
Right.
they were in the 70s. Both negative income tax and basic income were promoted as securing similar outcomes, and to some extent that's true. But Frank is right. The point about the basic income is that you would pay it to everybody. A negative income tax, you reduce the churn, as it's called, because you don't pay people something and then tax it back from them. You reduce the churn effect of a basic income, but you lose the point that you're making, James. You lose the simplicity of paying it to everybody. I suppose, in a sense, it's a difference between a practical question of how do you distribute and a principled question of whether you give everybody as an individual the amount of money. And some of the arguments are principled arguments. Let me just throw a slight spanner into those principled argument works. So another dimension which is also debated both in principle and in practice is the difference between individual and shared incomes, and in particular incomes for couples, because that does in the end up muddying the water in a way which I think makes it more difficult to sustain a practical argument for an individual basic income, because at the moment all of our benefits, as has been explained, are geared largely on a shared basis, on a couple basis or a family basis.
Peter, can I just ask you to go on further? Isn't this, the other difference is the conditionality. Under the basic income, I'd get, say, my £8,000, and if I decided to do nothing, nobody would interfere with me. I'd just exist on my £8,000. If I could make the world go round for my world go round on that, that would be it.
And there has been...
And there's no system in existence now that would pay me £8,000 and allow me to be a loafer. Unless I was drawing my old age pension.
Except your pension.
Yes, it's all right for those of us over pension age, yes. And there has been a debate about that too, a kind of philosophical debate about the extent to which it does promote. The example that's often quoted is that of surfers on Malibu Beach. Surfers on Malibu Beach would be paid a sufficient income that all they need to do all day is surf. They're often quoted because they tend not to be seen as a terribly sympathetic group. You know, why should we be supporting surfers on Malibu Beach? But the principle applies to all, really. And it's linked to the difficult question of then how do you incentivise people to take difficult employment? Because I agree with Declan, jobs aren't going to disappear, and indeed the jobs that are going to continue are often going to be those that aren't particularly attractive to do. Caring work, that's right. You're going to need to pay people a sufficient incentive to get them to do that, and I don't see that a generous basic income scheme is going to meet that challenge.
Andrew, I think you wanted to bring a point.
Thank you very much. First of all, let's start with children because they're less controversial. We could significantly increase child benefit, and that would be basically a basic income for children, which would be an act of horizontal distribution between people with children and without of similar incomes to recognise their extra living costs. But I want to make a wider...
When you say that, that's because you're accompanying that by your tax reforms, aren't
Correct.
you? Because there's no new pot that we haven't discovered.
No, exactly. So what I'm talking about is reducing the tax allowance and redistributing that initially to children, but potentially, as I said, to non-working adults. You could do that progressively over decades without there being cash losers. Of course, if you did it in one go, there would be cash losers and it would be very, very politically controversial. The broader point I want to make is that when we look at the tax allowances and benefits side by side, we already have a broadly universal flat rate system. It's of lots of different benefits and lots of different tax allowances, but the net effect is that we give the same amount of cash, if you include tax allowances as cash, to rich and poor alike. And that means that actually this debate isn't, in my view, really about how much extra it would cost overall. It's about, is it a sensible idea to rationalise the whole system into one? And my view is it isn't. And the reason I think it isn't is that it would overall not have positive distributional impacts. It would end up, you'd have a huge great reform, and modelling by Compass, who are not... If on a revenue neutral basis, or broadly revenue neutral, you would end up more or less where you started, with particularly low income non-working households not being any better off. And in fact, modelling by Compass suggested poverty would rise with the full basic income, which is the principal reason that I'm not convinced by it.
I'm going to come to Mari first.
In theory, I think this sounds like an absolutely magic idea, and that's why, Louise, I'm wanting to try and understand a wee bit more of the practical side of it, because one of the few concerns that I've got with this is there not a possibility that it could create a minimum income, that it could almost act as a ceiling, an income ceiling, because if employers know that everyone is guaranteed enough to get by, free of poverty, then there's never going to be another wage rise. Is that something that we've seen in different parts of the world or anything like that?
Well, we don't know exactly what the effect of a basic income would be.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's a very poor argument to argue against basic income because we think it might have a lowering effect on wages. I think the most important thing... Sorry?
That's one of the traditional arguments against means test, the poverty trap, was based on that very, very point.
Yeah, but there is no reason to assume, in fact, quite the contrary, that if people have basic security that allows them to refuse an unpleasant job, that would have a negative effect on wages. In fact, quite the opposite, which was just what I think was argued before, that one of the arguments that one of the panelists made was that we should not have it, because if we don't have it, then people will refuse to take low-paid, unpleasant or difficult jobs. So you can't swing it both ways. I think the important thing, really, is to make the case for why it is that we should accept that we should socialise basic income security at the bottom, just as we have already socialised entitlement to education and health. Mm-hmm. We don't question whether those on higher incomes receive public education or public health. Mm-hmm. We don't monitor their behaviour as to whether they're entitlement to these services. Mm-hmm. And so really there is no principal difference. And it's very odd in the 21st century that we should make this very sharp distinction. I think the biggest and most important rationale for basic income, although the redistributive argument is also very important, but the most important one is the relational freedom argument. It is about recreating a different relationship between citizens and the state, so that we recreate the sense of the state being an enabling state, a constitutive state that enables people. And in that sense, in answer to your question earlier on, how do we see the basic income? Is it a replacement for pays work? Is it potentially, do we view it in a positive way as a disincentive to engage in labour? No, I don't think that is how most proponents of basic income view the experiment. Yes, of course, if there are people who wish not to work, they're able not to do so. But the other argument is, why should people be made to do unpleasant jobs because they have no other alternative?
So just be clear.
But can I just say, on the international evidence...
It's incredibly important. Your central argument on that is that this will... Sorry, yeah. That your central argument then is that unpleasant and difficult work would have to be better remunerated, because people would be able to refuse it.
It would be bargained for on a more equal terms.
Because other people will pay through their paid income to subsidise it.
Just as everything else is bargained for in society, in a free society. And that seems to me only fair and right. It should be. But I should say, on the international evidence, of which we have quite a lot on the effects of economic security, the evidence is very clear that you do have very low rates of withdrawal from the labour market, where you have more stable income security. But typically the people who withdraw are mothers who look after their young children, or as we know from Canada, where there was an experiment that looked a little bit like a basic income between 74 and 79. In 2 municipalities, you had a 10% withdrawal rate from the labour market during those years. But the effect, this has been found by subsequent studies, that this were mothers who wanted to stay home with their small children, or young boys who had previously been encouraged to go into the labour force young, who stayed in school. So the withdrawal rates you see from experiments, of which there are many of different types, they are not exactly basic income, but look the same or have the same sort of effect, are that people think strategically about their contribution. And it's not the case that they withdraw in favour of non-contribution, but that they withdraw in favour of other types of contributions. And we have a wealth of studies. In fact, in many ways, I'm quite worried about some of the basic income experiment designs that we're seeing at the moment, and the idea that we stake the idea of a basic income and the importance of the principle on the results of those experiments. Because we actually have, as I already said, a lot of evidence already from long-term studies that show that security motivates, whereas some of the experiments that are ongoing now are very short-term and focused on very particular sets of individuals who have difficulties integrating in the labour market already.
How would the value of the basic income work? Because, I mean, for instance, the cost of living in Glasgow is very different to the cost of living in London. So how would you be able to look at that? Sorry, Anna.
The minimum income studies people do focus groups, and I contacted them and said, is there a difference in Scotland from the rest of the country? And apart from London, where housing and transport is more expensive, the rest of the country is very much more similar. Can I pick up on another point? You said, how much should it be? We have a couple of very good poverty benchmarks. The official EU poverty benchmark is 0.6 of median equivalised household income. And I'm sure you all know about that already, because the DWP publishes households below average income, and it gives the values of that in that publication, and it's published every year. So that would provide one which ensures that people are not living in poverty. The minimum income standards have been producing figures since 2008, and they update them every year, and they're slightly more generous. But either of those would give a good standard to see what would be possible to give. Now, how do we finance this? Taking up the point of my colleague on the left, I'm not sure which one it was, we have social security budget as opposed to the government expenditure. The last figures I have for 2015 to 16, the cost of social security was £262.5 billion. The cost of tax expenditures, which are benefits to taxpayers through the tax system, through the tax loopholes, in the same year amounted to 235 billion. 235 billion. That means that taxpayers get 17% of the total income in the country. That's different from GDP, because this is the money that goes through people's wallets and purses. 17% of that potential tax base is sheared off and given to taxpayers before the rest of it is taxed for it. What it does is reduce the tax base and increase the tax rate for people who can't afford paying it. Now, if you imagine the benefit system as being not just social security for poor people, but tax benefits for rich people, and put them together, you would have something like £500 billion. This would be sufficient to pay for improved, not quite as much as the EU official poverty benchmark, but it could certainly give £100 a week for every adult, more for pensioners and less for children.
Can I just check that social security figure you quoted? Does that include pensions and pensioner benefits?
Yes, it's
so
the lot.
It's that global figure. No.
Just it does. This is from the Blue Book, and yes, but under
that figure would correspond to the budget including tax credits.
Yeah,
just the scale of it.
Just following on from that,
limits, they do it in total managed expenditure.
If you speak without hitting the microphone, we're missing it. I'm sorry, Jane.
Just lastly, when I think of one of the few benefits that is still universal, it is the state pension. Now, my grandmother was able to live on purely the state pension. That's all she had. But even today, we don't expect people to do that anymore, because I think most folk would recognise that the state pension isn't enough in real terms. So how then, if we've allowed that situation to happen, how would you ensure that if there was a basic income, the value wouldn't deteriorate the same way the value of the state pension has deteriorated, if you know what I mean?
Right, let's very quickly, there's quite a lot. Now, let's take Annie, then Andrew, then Becca, and then I want to move to Craig. So, Annie.
This problem isn't unique to the idea of a basic income. It's the national insurance benefits have been eroded since they were introduced under the 1946 Act, and they used to be more than the means-tested benefit system, which themselves have been eroded, but now it's the other way around. Instead of being the means-tested benefit being a safety net, it is the main way. The state pension is about £120 a week at the moment, but people who have only that or less can apply for pension credit, which is a means-tested benefit, and that would automatically entitle them to housing benefit if they qualify as well. So we should really take pension credit as the necessary amount we need, not the state pension. State pension isn't universal, it's dependent on your contribution record. I would like to see something in a constitution. Unfortunately, we don't have a constitution in this country. Makes it very easy for people to manipulate to do what the people in power want to happen. I would like to see some legislation under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which I think we've signed up to. Then we ought to be able to apply for it on that basis.
The new state pension, which is just in the process of being implemented, is actually much closer to looking like a basic income and is paid at a level that many will consider is sort of close to adequacy. It's at the same level as pension credit. But we've got this huge discrepancy between the older people's social security system and the system for working age. So you've got the basic income, the basic level of support is around £72 a week if you're a single unemployed person, and £155 a week for a pensioner. Along with other colleagues, in terms of fighting poverty, I would like to see that basic level of support going to someone out of work, of working age, to be much higher. Where I disagree is I can't see that working as a pure universal payment up to a level around £155 a week, which is why I support a tiered system. You could create a social security system which included a universal element, which might be £40 or £60 a week, plus a means-tested element, plus some contributory entitlements, and the package could take you up to around £155 a week, similar to pensioners for working age. But I don't believe we would ever be able to sell it politically in terms of public consent or afford to have a universal income that was up at that level.
Does that not, though, defeat the purpose of a basic income if you've got that tiered system?
It defeats the purposes that colleagues on my right have talked about. I see this as a tax reform that is better using the tax expenditure that we currently devote only to people earning sufficient amounts, and I want to see that distributed broadly as a flat rate level of support, whether you're working or not.
Becca, I'll come to you in a second, Louise, but you want to
Yeah.
come in or not?
Thank you, Steve. So following from Louise's comments about changing the labour market, so in fact employers would be competing for labour, which we don't currently have. I wanted to speak from two particular perspectives. So my own UNISON branch, which is 5,000 workers across the region from the charity, voluntary sector and community sector, as well as significant numbers in the large housing associations. One of our majority sectors that we organise is care workers. And I've got a dual interest here because I've also, as well as having loved ones in my own family and friends who have worked in care, in recent years I've become a family member of, in fact, that one of those relatives who's worked in care has become a recipient of care after my younger sister had a very severe brain injury in 2013 that's left her fully dependent on care now, and in fact under deprivation of liberty for her own safety. And we'll all be aware that the way the care industry is currently structured is that, and our social security system is structured, is that people can be compelled to take care work on pain of losing their income. Under the sanction regime, you could be compelled to take up agency care work. And having seen it from the inside as well, without going into too much detail, my sister has been on the receiving end of care that's actually left her more emotionally damaged than she was when she first went into be needing care in the first place. And quite simply, it's not a job for everyone. It is an extremely difficult job. It's a very manual job, and it's also, as well as other, unlike other types of manual work, it's emotionally extremely difficult as well. It's exhausting, it's sad, you can be under risk of being injured by potentially clients. It's common to have very short staffing, and so, you know, there's been some comments raised already, oh, who's going to take this kind of work if they don't have to? Well, that's exactly the problem. We can't have a care industry that looks like this. This is one of my main interests in this kind of policy. We need to completely transform care. We need to value it. It's not going to be automated away at any point. It needs investing in. This has been mooted already. Tom Watts has mentioned it, but then also this week, the boss of the Mears Group that provides care has said the same thing. He's an employer saying we should be paying more like £11 an hour for care. It's a benchmark for society, isn't it? How we sort of look after our most vulnerable. We all have family members who could need care and will need care in future. We're all going to age, and it's just absolutely nightmare way that we're running the care industry at present. The other one to refer to is, and it was in the pre-hearing questions, about self-employed workers, which is a growing sector. I want to speak about particularly workers in construction who, again, are compelled to be bogusly self-employed. So my own husband's one of those. He works as a tarmacker, and although he goes to work in a shirt with a company logo and he doesn't own his own equipment to do the job, he doesn't choose where the jobs are, his boss has told him and most of the rest of his gang that they have to register as self-employed. So he gets no employer pension, he gets no sick pay, he gets no holiday pay, and again, it's an absolutely brutal job that damages your body permanently. And as workers are heading into middle age, when they should really be out of construction, you know, they're being left with injured backs, much like care workers can be. My own brother also has worked in construction on a self-employed
Becca,
basis.
can I just come in? Isn't that a case for reforming and for the revenue to actually say these are not self-employed jobs rather than turn the whole social security system upside down with the basic income?
Well, I definitely believe that anyway, but I also believe we need basic income. I do, yeah. And so we have a situation where a manual worker needs rest and holiday for their own health and safety. But in fact, if you're going to do that, you're actually losing money. So every day you're not at work, you lose money. And my brother worked once for pretty much a whole year without any days off because of his employment status, and that was in construction. So those are the interests from my perspective of what it might mean for workers to just really rebalance that situation where you're compelled to take work that people shouldn't be compelled to take. we need a highly trained and well-rewarded care industry that we can see a lot more job sharing, so people aren't having to do 40 hours a week caring. We could have much more people employed in industry, trained, and being able to have time away from what is very difficult work. And that was the point I wanted to make.
Louise, and then I'll bring Craig in.
Sorry, I just wanted to make a very quick clarification, because I think there has been the impression in the past that basic income replaces or is an alternative to a range of other institutions in society, including contributory institutions, as well as, so in general, the social security system, and or even to paid work. So I want to be very clear that there's no reason why, and many basic income advocates believe, that you can combine a basic income with a tiered contributory welfare system. I'm not saying I'm necessarily an advocate of that or that all basic income supporters are, but there's absolutely no reason, and many basic income supporters do believe that there's a very good reason to combine a subsistence floor that is guaranteed with a tiered contributory welfare system. What is very important, however, is that the contributory systems need to change. We all know that the way that the contributory systems work nowadays don't allow a large number of the labour force to contribute. And so there needs to be reform to the contributory systems, and there needs to be reforms to self-employed status and the sort of rights and benefits that self-employed workers have. So, but again, there's no trade-off. There's no choice to be made between making those changes, which are necessary, and making a change to the lowest level of basic income assistance by removing conditionalities. The way conditionalities work nowadays is very counterintuitive. You have the level of conditionalities that exist keep increasing as work becomes more complex. And what that means is that conditionalities become more punitive and more difficult to exercise.
Sorry, what do you mean specifically by conditionalities?
Well, for example, you now have in-work conditionalities. Before, you used to have conditionalities to prove that you were willing to work. Now you have in-work conditionalities, which means when you are in work, you also have to prove exactly how many hours you're working. Right, and of course for someone, so that means that you might be forced. In fact, I can read from your website. In-work conditionalities means that if you are earning below your threshold, you will be expected to make efforts to increase your income. The DWP suggests that this may include increasing the hours you work, finding additional work, or finding a new job with a higher income.
Yeah, that's how tax credit works.
Isn't that a good thing?
Well, what it means is that you are, every single week that your income or hours may change, you are scrutinized. Now, the cost of doing that and the kinds of relationships you create between citizens and state, employers and employee, in having all of these checks performed, it's just irrational.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but it brings back up to the original point about tax credits. If you have a means-tested system, you have to constantly, to one degree or another, scrutinise it, because obviously if your income increases or whatever, you no longer are entitled.
Well, I think
so. It seems to me that this comes back to how generous the universal income is, because if it isn't very generous, you will have this problem because you'll get all the top-ups. If it is very generous, then there's the issue about cost, etc. And I think, to a certain extent, those who are proposing it have got to give us some sense of what the figure, the payment would be.
Okay, we'll come back to that later, but Louise, do you want to just...
No, I just want to say, I think you're right, that there are any means-tested system, if the world of work is quite deregulated and precarious, is going to be difficult to implement. And that's something that needs to be looked at. But I don't think that's an argument against making the basic tier unconditional, because there's a difference between exercising conditionalities on someone on the pain of losing their basic security, and then exercising conditionalities to adjust the benefit at a higher rate of income.
Yeah, okay, I want to ask Craig, who's an alumnus of this institution, if you'd like to put his points.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah, very, very happy to be back in Birmingham. I'm almost in tears with those old welling up of thoughts and memories of this great place. No matter where we are, I think, on the political spectrum, left or right, I would assume that we're all after a tax and benefit system that maximises the participation of people in work, because I think there is a self-worth that comes with work and earning your own money. We want an economy that's growing. We want Britain to be globally competitive, and for people just to be doing well. I think they are broad aims that we'd all like, no matter where we come from. Now, I'm a chartered accountant, chartered tax advisor, so I know the tax system fairly well. I'd like to think I'm fairly good on tax credits and the general benefit system because we're on Work and Pensions Select Committee, so we're probably better informed than some. But I would not even like to start to model the whole benefits and tax system in terms of, you've got free school meals, you've got entitlement to dental care at a certain level, you've got free prescriptions. You know, there is so much going on. There are disincentives and rates and cut-offs. It is a very complex to actually work out what your real rate of tax is for earning that additional pound within our system. Very, very complicated to work out. So from probably a right-of-centre libertarian point of view, I'd probably be sort of along Ben's thoughts on a lot of this, and this is an area I've thought about very carefully for some years. Because of the complications of the system, wouldn't it be nice to just get rid of all that froth, get rid of all the bureaucracy, the form filling, the cut-off rates, the marginal rates of tax loss and benefits loss, and have something rather more simple? Now, that's where we then get to the complication of how do we do something different. And it would be useful to model what should the amount be. Now, I was sort of with everyone until perhaps Annie said, but we'll need to have something special for housing benefit, and we'd have something special for disability benefits, and that's all well and good. So what is the floor level if you're perhaps don't need a house or you're not disabled? Would it be JSA? Or would it be JSA plus something? Because it's deemed by society and Parliament that JSA, whether you like it or not, is deemed by everybody, by our elected house, that is a sufficient amount to add to the incentive to actually get you into work, but it's enough to help you to survive while you're looking for work. We may have views on whether that's enough or not. What would the tax rate need to be under a system if we just said, that I'd like, it's a standard level, no more, no less, and it's enough to cope with disability, it's enough to cope with your housing issues? That would probably need to be quite a lot of money. I would imagine that would be into your £200 a week, maybe perhaps even more, £250. What would the rate be? What would be the tax rate for UK citizens to actually keep all that going? Would that make Britain globally competitive? Would it, and this is my main fear, would it encourage economic inactivity? What would the youngster at 18 or 21, just out of university, in receipt of £200 a week, or whatever the level it might be, he might think, do you know what, I can sit on the beach in Indonesia for half the year, and then I can go off to India for the rest of the year, because that 10 grand a year, or whatever it might be, is enough to help me to just live that easy lifestyle. So, would we be encouraging economic inactivity? And I think that is the very dangerous side of this. If it's not enough for people to survive, then we've destroyed what this whole concept is all about. So I would say the poverty level as well. We do get very hung up on what poverty is in the UK. We've got this measure of 60% of median income. And this system, if we were to actually add this basic income to everybody, I think we would then find we'd actually, under that measure, have more poverty. Because I'd have that extra, James would have that extra, but there would be this base of people on this basic income, and that would be a lot of people at less than the 60% median level. So perversely, we could actually, under this very blunt measure that we've been using for years, be creating poverty. But what would someone like me do with this extra 10 grand that lands in my lap? I would be paying some of it back in tax, probably at 40%. And what would I do with the rest of it? I don't know. Will I buy something extra that I wouldn't have bought? So I may be paying a bit of extra VAT, or would I just save it? So for someone like me, this would be a total waste of that additional tax that's being borne by the country. We do have a sort of a similarity, I think, in operation. That is for the elderly under the new basic rate pension of £155 a week. That is sort of in the ballpark. We do have a sort of measure of basic income.
I don't want to interrupt you.
No, I know.
I'm
just trying to encompass
yeah,
this
I'm just
together.
wondering, but
so
to give the panel a chance to respond.
If you can argue for simplicity, I think I'd be listening. But all I'm hearing at the moment is we've got something wrong with our benefit system, let's change it and actually make it just as complicated as one we're trying to replace in the first place.
Can I...
No, I think we've got your view.
Can I respond very quickly to one of the small points?
Well, hang on a second, because I'm just going to bring in Declan, and then I'll come straight to Ben. Go on.
Okay. So just very quickly, when it comes to looking at the cost of universal basic income or any other change to the tax and benefit system, we need to be clear what we mean by cost. And in particular, looking at the gross fiscal cost is actually pretty unhelpful for some of the reasons we've already seen today with the discussion about negative income tax and so on. Because money is churning around and being taken away from people and given back, we're not necessarily getting a good idea of the cost to society or to the economy just by looking at gross fiscal figures. So we want it with very, very big, scary-sounding figures like 500 billion or whatever, and that's not necessarily telling us what we need to know because we're not taking account, for example, of the cost of the existing tax allowances in the current system. So the economic cost or the social cost, one way of getting at that is to look at what the impact on marginal tax rates is. In other words, what would the basic rate of income tax need to rise to in order to fund these transfers? That's an economic cost because although economists differ on the optimal level of income taxation, and many economists would say that it's actually quite a bit higher than current levels or current rates of income taxation. Nonetheless, most economists, I think, would agree that there is an optimal level, and you shouldn't get too high above it. Otherwise, you will start incurring genuine economic costs, which reduce your ability to fund, for example, the basic income transfer. Now, the figure that I have in my head for the cost of a very basic income is the figure that Donald Hirsch produced for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation a couple of years ago. If I remember correctly, this does not include housing costs, and it doesn't include a special payment for disability either, but I could be wrong on that. But the figure was a 55% basic rate of income tax, and bear in mind that because it's a basic income proposal, the 55% is charged on the first pound that people earn, because the basic income replaces the tax-free allowance. So that gives an order of magnitude for a fairly modest, unambitious form of basic income of a basic income tax of around 55%, just to give some idea of the scale of the impacts. And
Can you just clarify, so you mean as soon as you work and start paying tax, you pay at 55%?
Yes, but bear in mind, you're receiving a basic income, which is replacing your tax allowance. Yeah.
What was the basic income in his model there?
The basic income would have been some. I can't remember all the details. I think it was set at around JSA rates.
Yes, it was.
And it didn't include housing costs, if I remember correctly.
The RSA's numbers are very different from that.
Yeah.
So, they've got a much closer to cash neutral model.
Okay, look, I just want to give. There's lots
Was Donald's model not cash
to respond, so let me just take this in order. Let's move to Ben. Yeah, let's move to Ben, then I'll come to Louise, and then to Annie. So Ben. Then I'll come.
Mine's just a quick point on whether it will lead to less working overall. I think the answer is we don't know, and that's because there's two effects at play. So there's an income effect and a substitution effect. Basically, any realistic basic income or negative income tax proposal is going to reduce the implicit marginal tax rate on extra hours. So extra hours will be will pay you higher. However, it's also likely to give you a higher income for doing 0 hours than you were under the previous system. So it means your income is higher, there's less desire to work overall, but each extra hour pays you more. So when we've done experiments, mentioned the Manitoba experiment in Canada, but there were also 5 in Gary, Indiana, and in Seattle and across the USA. And the reason why these never made it into policy is because they were worried because there seemed to be a small increase in divorce in one of the subgroups. But in terms of the work effects, there was extra work by men and lower work by women, which roughly balanced each other out in terms of there was no overall effect from the higher income. And most of the lower work from women was from women with kids. In fact, pretty much all of it was. Many of them single mothers, which is probably a group where we might not mind if they do less work. They probably need to do less work, probably. So that's just a framework to think about it. We don't know for sure whether it will increase or reduce work. Because we know it will raise the incentive to do an extra hour, but it might reduce the incentive to do hours at all. That's hard to answer.
Thank you. Louise.
I just want to say, I think the figures you quoted are based on a very old calculation, a very old model, and we should mention that there are some very up-to-date, intricate calculations done by the Citizens Income Trust, specifically Malcolm Torrey, who's not here today, but he has worked out figures for a revenue-neutral basic income in the UK, and it's worth looking at. It's very detailed. And on the basis of his figures, which would pay out 60% to a working-age adult, £60 to a working age per week, pardon me, the income tax rate would be 23% for an income up to £42,385, and 43% on incomes over that, and then 48% on incomes over 150,000.
So it's a 3% increase on where we are.
Yes, a 3% increase in taxes from where we are today, which would roughly work within a progressive system as 23% on earnings up to £42,385, 43% on earnings over 42,385, and 48% on incomes over 150,000.
That's for a basic income that is below the current JSA level.
Which would be presumed to be supplemented with some means-tested benefits. He specifically wanted to show that a basic income reform could be done on a tax-neutral basis tomorrow. That's the purpose of his calculation. So it's important.
Someone's unemployed would have less money.
No, because it would.
Well, I mean, just to explore that, I mean, if you were prepared to start from a starting point that people on JSA, who are effectively some of the people who have the lowest income in the country, take a fairly substantial reduction in their income.
Because I haven't read the whole
means.
paper. I haven't read the whole paper. It would be supplemented with means-tested benefits, so there will be no losses on the point of implementation.
Okay, I'm just going to take Annie and then Peter.
Right. Just following on that point, in Malcolm Torrey's system, these small basic income levels are embedded in the current social security system, and that level is taken into account when means-tested benefits are given. So they would still get their JSA levels, but £60 a week would be independent. It wouldn't be checked out. It'd be unconditional.
Doesn't simplify the system, though, does it?
There's less means testing. Housing benefits still means tested, but there'd be less means testing, yes.
And less work conditionalities, which is the key.
Yeah. Can I take up the point?
Hang on. Sorry, did you have another point?
I've got several. When someone said that Donald Hirsch quoted 20% income tax, I think he was quoting me from a paper about 10 years ago when I was first looking at the minimum income standards and worked out that if every single household received what he said, and I've got the numbers of household, and the income tax system hadn't changed, then that would what it would cost. That was 10 years ago. I've done a lot more work since then, and I put a constraint that the income tax should never go over 50% as a standard rate. It could go up to 50% or 60% for higher and additional rate people, which I think is...
doubling the standard rate.
I haven't said that. Sorry?
No,
I agree with Richard Murphy that you can't cap incomes, but you can tax them. But I think 60% is probably as much as I would go at the moment. If other people, I mean, in Sweden they have 65% tax.
We've got a 60% tax rate, as you're aware, between 100,000 and twice the personal average.
Yes, well, it's only 23,000 from 100 to 23,000 this year, and it was less before.
But that has its own behavioural aspects.
Peter.
I think this detailed argument about the cost of it may be a little bit of a red herring, because I've read a lot of this stuff over the years, and at the end of the day, I think your intuition is right. Either you have a very high level of basic income, in which case you're going to have massively increased levels of taxation because there is nowhere else for the money to come from, or you do it on the revenue neutral basis that people have been talking about. But if you do it on a revenue neutral basis, you don't actually solve any of the problems, because you need to retain all of the means testing and all of the other elements of the benefit system that currently may or may not be causing problems. The problem is you don't solve them like this. It's either too expensive or it isn't worth having.
I'm going to take one more point from Louise, and then I'm going to bring it back in.
I said at the outset that the basic income is not an attempt to solve all of the problems. Okay, and I think one of the mistakes in the debate is when questions answers evolve around whether it will solve the housing crisis and whether there would be housing benefit and so on. It's designed to solve or improve the implementation of basic income security, and that's all. We need other policies to solve other kinds of problems in the labour market, in education, in care, and so on. But can I just say that if we look, for instance, at what countries across the OECD are spending on public administration of employment assistance systems and on training for unemployed people in those situations, what you find is that the UK is spending, that has the worst ratio in terms of administration to investment in people, right? So the United Kingdom is spending 0.33% of GDP on administration, the same as Denmark and Sweden, but it's spending 0.08%, which is 13 times less than Sweden on training and education for people in unemployment. So it's the basic income cannot solve that problem. That problem, in terms of the situation that unemployed people face in terms of reintegration into work, requires public investment in other areas.
Right.
Peter, I wanted to talk to you, but you've actually largely answered the point, but I'm going to put it another way. I mean, there are at least two arguments running through our seminar today, or witness group. That is a negative income tax argument, which we're not inquiring into. We're looking at citizens' income scheme, which is where we've got people to represent their views. And what you're saying to us, that you very early on looked at this proposal and you gave us conclusions just now, that in fact if it's going to be worthwhile, it's going to cost a huge amount in raising tax revenue. And if it's not going to raise but if you're going to leave the tax revenue where it is, you can't actually do very much on the citizens' income scheme anyway. So why actually go down this route? So that when we look at that pamphlet that you wrote all those years ago, we can read it with that statement you've just made to the committee, that nothing much has changed in your argument. Is that right?
Yes, that would be the case. If you want to read a more recent iteration of a similar sort of position, David Piarsho, Emeritus Professor at the LSE, has just published a paper which you can get through the LSE's case paper website. I think it's case paper 200.
Sorry, what was that name again?
Piarsho, Piachaud, David Piarsho. He's, a colleague of mine. He makes very similar arguments, and it's more accessible than my paper, which of course was before digitalisation, so can only be accessed in a paper form in an obscure library somewhere. You may have difficulty tracing it in practice. And what's more, it's before I was digitalised, so I don't have it in digital form either.
But you have it in paper form, Peter?
I couldn't find one for today. I'm going to go back and have another look.
Will you try and find it for us so
yes,
we can have a
will.
read? Thanks.
Yeah.
That's it. Thank you.
Okay, well, look, I think we're coming close to the end now. I think what would be useful is just to do one last run down the panel, and if there's any kind of concluding points that you feel have been missed or anything you really want to clarify or make sure we hear before we leave, that would be helpful. I think I'll start at the other end with Andrew on this occasion, and I'll just work down. Thank you.
Sure. So, I mean, as I've been saying, I don't support replacing means-tested benefits, but I do support a universal element to the welfare system. And what has changed since Peter was writing his paper in the 80s is the tax allowance system. It's so generous now that it has changed the terms of this debate, that we give £60 a week at the moment, going up to 68 by 2020 to people with jobs, compared to the 72 or 73 to people without. We have an almost flat rate system at the moment. The question is, should we integrate them? A couple of small points that came up early in the hearing I want to respond to as well. One is that you could have these sorts of systems with some conditionality. The phrase that's used is a participation income, and it was originally proposed by Sir Tony Atkinson, who's just sadly passed away. The other question that came up early, just to touch on in passing, is migration, which you asked, James. You could design this system so that it became a sort of a ramped-up entitlement once new migrants had paid in taxes for a certain number of years, so that they were making a significant net contribution to the exchequer before their entitlement started.
They would all disappear abroad, where you could have a residence.
Oh, you're asking the opposite way.
Yes. Yeah.
There's a lot of people that I know. Immigrants coming out are not scroungers. They are here to work. The point is, the more generous, the more we'll be dependent on them to do the type of work which they're already currently doing, and I don't see that changing.
So the key is that the sort of proposals I've been talking about and the other revenue neutral proposals is that if you're a full-time worker, you're left with no change to your overall tax benefit situation. So there shouldn't be major work incentive changes for full-time workers. It's really about people working very low hours or very low rates of pay who would be affected.
Okay, thanks. Declan.
As a general comment, As a general comment, I think a lot of what we hear in terms of the case for basic income is proposing basic income as a solution to problems which also have other potential solutions, and those other solutions need to be addressed as well. So one of the commonest arguments that we hear in favour of basic income turns on conditionality and turns in particular on the use of benefit sanctions and indeed the current benefit sanctions regime administered by the Department for Work and Pensions, which is I think universally recognised to be considerably harsher than any sanctions regime we've ever had in the past. And my response to that is that there is absolutely no logic which dictates that we have to have as draconian a sanctions system as we currently have. We didn't have it until 2012. We don't need to have it in the future. That is something which is eminently reformable. In fact, it's reformable at the stroke of a minister's pen. It doesn't even require primary legislation. So conditionality, and in particular the sanctions which are causing so much controversy, are things which are within the gift of the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions already. We do not need basic income in order to get away from that. I think it will be interesting to see what comes out of some of the pilots which are currently taking place or currently being set up in Europe and in Canada, which will explore what happens when you take conditionality out of the picture altogether. It's not a full basic income. It's nothing like the utopian schemes that are sometimes promoted, but it is taking conditionality out and then seeing what happens, and that I think will be interesting. The other area where I think UBI is being proposed as a solution to problems which should be addressed or could be addressed by other means is the whole area of flexibility of work, the gig economy, and etc. etc. And there, I think we should be conscious that the futurology of work has for a long time tended to always point in the same direction, which is we're going to lose massive amounts of jobs and never replace them again, and it's all going to be ultra-flexible. The employment relation, as we have known it for decades, will actually cease to exist, and people will be essentially engaged in a kind of a spot contract where you get hired by the hour to carry out tasks. That's the way the futurology of work has, at least the pessimistic futurology of work has always looked for as long as I've been around. And it has proved to be a very, very poor guide indeed to what was actually going to happen. For example, the percentage of the workforce who have a permanent employment contract has barely changed in 30 years. Okay, we do have new forms of precarity, we have new forms of more flexible types of working emerging, but they are not yet sweeping away the existing employment relations, and we should not assume that they are going to. We should not assume that the economic rationale of modern capitalist societies is towards ultra-flexibility. Many people may believe that, but the evidence, historically, is actually rather strongly against them. What we should be looking at, and what we could be looking at in things like the care sector, is building employment relations in those sectors which are more like the employment relations that the majority of the workforce can actually take for granted, with permanent contracts, with proper in-work benefits, with entitlements to holiday pay and sick pay, and so on.
Mary, I think you'd...
Yeah, just on what you were saying about sanctions, I mean, I don't think it'll be of surprise to anyone, I agree with you. But I suppose, do you not give merit to the idea, though, that if we were to introduce some sort of basic income, that part of what would be good about it is that it is changing the relationship between citizen and state, so that we're not seeing things just as wholly practical of sanctions, they're not good there, let's change that doesn't answer that. Is it not a case of going, no, we need to start changing how the entire system works and how people view the system and how sort of society fits in with the state? Is there not a real opportunity there?
I think there is, and I'm very sympathetic to those arguments. I'm actually a reluctant supporter of conditionality, and if you're a reluctant supporter of conditionality, which I am, which is based on the evidence basically been that you would just have more people drifting away from the labour market. But if you're a reluctant supporter of conditionality, you have to be also a reluctant supporter of some kind of sanctions to back up that conditionality, not a sanctions regime, I'm afraid, that we have at the moment, a much milder one. There is really, sanctions are not a policy instrument in social security. They are a backstop to your policy instruments, and they should not be used to try and deliver policy outcomes. But I have to say honestly that as a reluctant supporter of conditionality, I'm a reluctant supporter of sanctions as well.
Yes, I think it's interesting the way we ended up sitting here, didn't we? Because we didn't plan to sit like this. You heard my general views before and answered to Frank's question. So the only further comment I'd like to make is that I'm concerned about the policy or the political impact of this debate, and I suppose my message to you really is that because I think it's something it's either utopian or it isn't worth pursuing. I think it is a political distraction. There are all sorts of problems with the benefit system, and there are all sorts of issues there. We need to look at what the role of the state is to support employment, to improve the provision of care, to give better incentives for people to take certain kinds of jobs. They can be dealt with and should be dealt with within the existing structures that we operate with. Spending time and possibly a large amount of money introducing something which either won't make any difference or will be unachievable is a dangerous distraction. So my advice to you would be put your efforts elsewhere.
So I found myself in slightly strange position of agreeing more or less equally with both sides. I favour the policy. I favour the policy, but for quite different reasons to the other people who favour the policy, and maybe they found themselves in a similar position of thinking you're making bad arguments for the policy I like because my argument's very different. I think.
And which policy are you supporting?
So this is actually one of my summing up points.
Citizens' income.
My summing up point is that
you
ought to see the tax and benefit system as one system. And what we are doing is we are trying to create a sort of progressive redistribution. A lot of what we do is about redistribution. We're taking money from those who earn a lot and give it to people who earn less. Now we can take it in. Well, we have a very, very progressive tax system relative to what you could have. It could be a lot more progressive, and we can argue about the level of progressivity. But on balance, if you look at decile incomes before and after tax, I mean, it makes a massive difference. We're obviously doing quite a lot of redistribution. We could do more, but my argument is that even if we keep it the same, we could do it in a better way. And I don't think it's important to. I think you should look at how much you give to people net of how much you take from them, not look at it as two separate things. It's one policy instrument. And therefore, I do think the basic income and negative income tax are in principle the same policy. Now, it may be that the advocates of the two have been different in terms of what levels they believe it should be set at and how they ought to administer the system. But I don't believe we should see it as a massive distinction between the two. And that is my summing up.
Thank you. Becca.
Thank you. One thing that I wanted to draw the committee's attention to, who hasn't been mentioned, is Simon Duffy from the Centre for Welfare Reform is not here today, and he's done quite a lot of work around an idea of basic income plus, which is his approach to how we provide for people who do have additional costs because of a disability. And he maintains that everybody should receive the same basic income payment and build something on top of that. He would be in favour of testing of disability to go back to being responsibility of GPs, so it's less onerous than it is now. But the argument he makes returns to that kind of philosophical idea that we do, at a human level, have the similar essential basic needs for sustenance and survival that's common to all of us. And so in that way, by making the payment to everybody, and it's kind of could have an interestingly powerful and new sort of cohesive effect on society that we're yet to really experience. So the unifying potential of that payment to all is something I think could be really interesting in terms of helping us psychologically get a grip of some of the other really great challenges that are facing us as, not just a country but a planet, humans on the planet, things that are coming our way that we need to really pull together and get a handle on. So this is in kind of step with moving towards recognising what we have in common at the kind of species level. I maintain that the amount and the way of funding it is a question of political will, ultimately, and it's about objectives of the decision makers. And income and wealth and economic equality has been rising in recent years. I would be very strongly in favour of us aggressively turning back the tide on that. So we're going to continue over the coming months to have our conversations with people outside this room of what they think of this approach to income security, and we very much hope that you start hearing it on the doorstep from your own constituents in the near future. So beyond just the realm of policy wonks and journalists to actually, for you to be hearing it from the people who vote for you. So final thing I want to do is just hand over this evidence to the committee as well to have a look at. Oops. And thank you for having me here today.
Annie.
Just a few details. Craig would not have an extra 10,000 a year, it would all be clawed back. I would have a residency qualification so that people have to actually reside in the country for the majority of the year in order to get it, so they couldn't swan off to other places for most of the year. You could build in a small earnings disregard in order that you don't have to tax the first pound. I would index it to some proportion of average income per head, and therefore if it's the same proportion for the administration of a government, then if the average income went down, then the level would go down. People would say, I used not to be, I could manage before, I can't manage now, I better go out and get a few more hours work. So you'd actually have a self-stabling mechanism. One of my criticisms of the current system, national insurance and social assistance levels, is that it's based on men's working patterns, and it doesn't meet women's needs at all, and we haven't discussed that. It may be an accident that we three women are here protecting women's interests, and one of the ways to do that is to individualise the unit of assessment and delivery, because it really badly affects women. So that would be one very helpful thing. Secondly, the present system in its selectivity penalises couples. Couples can actually get more benefit by living apart than living together. So that's another thing that would be very easy to do. And Baroness Stroud wrote a note to George Osborne last year recommending this should be done. The other things we've been talking about, one of the problems with the current system is the structure. It's not based on the individual, it's not universal, it's targeted on poor people. This segregates them and makes it much easier to stigmatise them, humiliate them and reject them, leading to low take-up. So targeting does not protect poor people. Universal systems are protected by both rich and poor, so it's actually better for poor people. Means testing benefits under the current system, people could find that they're actually having a marginal deduction rate of up to 96%, and that's in the Welfare to Work book that came out in 2011. Universal credit reduces it down to 65% if you're below the personal allowance and only 76%. This is still very regressive. Poor people pay a much higher rate of deductions than the higher income earners, which is 62 or 67%, including the lower national insurance rate. That should be changed too. The national insurance rate should be put up to 12% for everybody. Otherwise, it's just a regressive system. And lastly, the unconditionality. Those of my colleagues on my left, who are actually on the right, actually like freedom of choice. So unconditionality is very important for that. At the moment, we have freedom of choice for rich people, but not for poor people. I want freedom of choice for poor people. I want them to have more choice over their lifestyles, their life-work balance. I want people to be able to say, no, I work half-time. The present system doesn't cope with working half-time. You're either in work or out of work. How does it cope with 0 hours contracts? Are you employed or are you not employed? How does it cope with this? There's so many things wrong with the current system. If you change each of those, or even some of them, if you change each of them, you'll end up with a basic income system. But you could actually start at the moment by changing some of those features to improve the system, make it better for women, make it better for poor people in particular. And can I recommend my new book coming out in March? And can I give you a couple of leaflets after when you go? And they're not necessarily the views of the Citizens Income Trust. It's personal work that I've been doing, but I'd like to leave them. Leaflets are easier to read than a book. So.
Pass on from the advertising. Thank you very much. And Louise.
Just a few words. I think it's very interesting that it seems to me most people on the panel actually have made arguments for basic income. If you want to ease the benefit sanctions regime, you are really transitioning towards a basic income. So I'm very happy to hear that we seem to have a lot of consensus on the panel. I think the panel has also broadly agreed that the basic income is indeed complementary with a range of other policies, and it's very important to see it that way. And it's constitutive of transformation in other policy areas, which is very important when we think about how to recreate a care sector that is better protected, both for those who deliver the work and who receive care. And if you think about the ways in which we might be able to incentivise the public sector looking at and investing in other areas of bringing people within society, which is much easily done when people are disincentivised by very, very high rates of withdrawal rates on their tax when they enter into work, or the fear of losing basic security, which is what you have when you have a conditional benefit system at the base. So for all of those reasons, and I see the basic income as a natural evolution, as an institutional transformation of the welfare state that is happening anyhow by many other names and by many other means. And I think it's just a logical next step to try and actually look at the way we can facilitate that institutionally and through the tax benefit system, which is what I think we've done today. But we've only opened the debate, and what I really hope is that this is a precursor to looking into the matter more seriously. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Well, we've had about an hour and a half. I'm not sure we've got total agreement from our witnesses, but we've certainly had a fascinating range of views and some excellent contributions. It just remains for me to thank, on behalf of the committee, thank the witnesses very much indeed. Thank you.